Hello, everyone. My name's Emma Jones. I'm here with my colleague Gareth Bramley, and we are both legal academics at the University of Sheffield School of Law. We're going to talk to you a little bit today about two projects we've been involved in, which are all kind of focused around developing students' digital literacies. And I say we're using the term literacies quite broadly here to encompass the kind of skills if we use Anne's definition as well. One of these projects is the digital lawyering module. So we are one of the 79 modules that Cameron and UA referred to. We are a final year optional undergraduate module. Also going to talk a little bit about a pro bono project that I've set up and run over the last academic year called Sheffield Digital Justice. Before I do that, though, I wanted to make two acknowledgements and three general points. So the first acknowledgement, following on from Andy and Lucia's good practice, is that these slides are entirely the work of Canva AI. In doing them, I also discovered it's great at images, but not so good at wording. So you'll see that in slide 3. The other acknowledgement I want to make is that a lot of what we are going to say has already been touched on really well in the other presentations so far. So we may not name check every time it's been touched on, but we acknowledge that we're building on all these presentations that have already been done. In terms of my three general points, when we're talking about digital literacies, the first point I want to make is about the term digital natives and the idea that our students, largely due to their age, are digital natives. And I just want to emphasize that it's really important to problematize this concept, because we know very well that students' engagement with technology will have been mediated by their socio-economic status and by their individual characteristics. We also know that some digital literacies do not transfer easily into other environments and settings. So, for example, I am quite nifty with Microsoft Word now, but I really struggle to get Netflix on my TV. So they're not always necessarily transferable. The second point I wanted to make is, though we're talking about student digital literacies, we can't talk about that without referring to staff digital literacies as well. If we are being expected to guide and support our students to develop these ever more important digital literacies through the law degree, then as legal educators, it's assumed that we have a certain level of knowledge and understanding and ability. And that's simply not the case. And it may well be that for individuals to upskill themselves appropriately, this takes huge amounts of time and effort in a HE environment where, you know, there are ever increasing student numbers, there's ever increasing pressure. So we need to be aware of that in the background as well. The third point I want to make is about how we conceptualize the idea of digital literacies. So obviously, since its introduction into the kind of common parlance in the 1990s, this term has evolved. The very fact we use it in the plural now more commonly than just saying digital literacy is a good example of that, because we acknowledge that there are a wide range of literacies involved in dealing with digital technology. It is incredibly broad. It is not just about technical skills. And one thing we try to do in the projects we work on is really emphasize that breadth and really focus on those skills such as problem solving, creativity, collaboration. We also recognize that effectively digital literacies have a symbiotic relationship with what you might call soft skills or perhaps human skills, which are actually incredibly vital interpersonal skills and communication skills. So you cannot develop digital literacies unless you also pay attention to those type of skills alongside it. I do have some concerns that while I completely understand that it's incredibly important to talk about AI and assessment in law schools, that sometimes this dominates the discourse to the extent that we are not looking at AI in its broader forms. I also worry that if we do look at it in its broader forms, it's sometimes dominated by discourses about employability, particularly employability in the legal profession. And I think on that, it's important to bear in mind, actually, a minority of our students will probably be in that workplace. So I think it's really important we look at AI and law tech generally in terms of the fact that actually it has these much wider societal consequences that might be utopian in terms of reconfiguring the world of work in hugely positive ways, as well as the rest of society, could be dystopian. There are all these issues around sustainability, the environment, the exploitation of workers by big tech that we also need to think about. And that is why I think our key focus in terms of digital literacies in our project is about critical thinking, that we need students to engage and understand some of these wider issues. And to do that, critical thinking is absolutely vital. So I'm going to hand over to Gareth now to talk a little bit about the module we run together.
Thank you, Emma. Nice to see you all. Yeah, as Emma said, this is a Canva version of what we did. I don't know if it tells us anything about the module, but we'll talk a little bit about it. So yeah, I mean, I had the privilege to work with Emma for the first time on this module in the autumn term. For those of you who know Emma, that was a real pleasure for me. Emma's put a lot of work into this. It's very kind of her to call it our module, which, you know, I feel privileged to be part of, but Emma, I fully acknowledge how much work has gone into this. I think what I wanted to reflect on in particular were the bits that I enjoyed about this. So my background is as a practitioner. I've kind of focused a lot on teaching core modules on private law, on problem question technique, with a bit of essay technique sprinkled in, but a lot of respect for the doctrine. I'm studying for an EdD, so an education doctorate at the moment. I'm looking at a lot at critical pedagogy and critical legal approaches. This module was definitely the closest I've got to doing that with students, and that's probably why I enjoyed it the most, because, well, two things I've really reflected on is, number one, a lot of the doctrinal content is out or not foregrounded, that we took a much more critical approach to the different topics that we were discussing through a variety of formats. So the great thing about the module is it promotes working in groups, although it's been acknowledged earlier in the day that presents its challenge in terms of how the students perceive that. There's not a lot of group work that goes on prior to the final year in the law degree at the moment. So we have challenges about, you know, forming groups, norming, storming, performing, all that kind of stuff around group work. We don't assess the group work element. They do work on a particular project of their choosing. We do assess their reflections on working within a group. The other part of the assessment is an individual essay on a particular theme or themes. But there's elements of group work, there's elements of large, like seminar-based sessions, which are largely student-centered in terms of them working on a project. There's also a series of lectures, and there's a series of kind of like large all-cohort workshops where Emma and I talked together. So I really liked the variety. I really liked the ability to be able to talk about different aspects and to kind of drill into some of the more critical pedagogy or critical legal approaches, as I say, I probably don't achieve in the other stuff that I'm teaching. I've got loads of ideas about, I think we've both got loads of ideas about where we could go next with this module. I'd be interested in any thoughts, either at the end of this or in the break. But I think what I really wanted to say about this module outside of that is, yeah, trying to get beyond to speak with students about some of this stuff. I'm fascinated in the idea of failure. The word failure hasn't really been mentioned that much today, but would really like it to be kind of foregrounded in a lot of what we talk about, this perception or fear of failure, because my nervousness is that where we add in the kind of notions of digital skills, digital literacy, it can be an additional thing to beat people, us and students, over the head with, and it can become very individualistic and perpetuate the individualistic nature of learning, of higher education. That's my provocation anyway. And I think, again, what I've really liked the most about this module is the ability to speak to students more about a collective sharing of failure, of perceptions of success, of the way in which technology can both harness the ability to work collectively, but also manipulate that notion of individualism and that notion of the perfect individual. And I think that's what I'm most interested. I think we both are in terms of developing this further, because I think we touched on some aspects of that, but maybe currently it's challenging because there's so much in the module. There's so much that you perceive you have to, as Anne was just saying, so much you perceive you have to cover, so much content. But law has way too much content. Why on earth are we like obsessed with this notion of content? And it's not going away because the SQE just perpetuates that, massively perpetuates the notion of content, what we must include. And I'm also very conscious of that. Am I doing a disservice to students to just saying, let's forget about the content for a moment. Let's just have a discussion about some of this stuff on a more informal, compassionate basis. But I'll stop talking because I know Emma wants to talk a bit about digital justice.
Thank you. So the other project that's been that I've been working on over the past year is a pro bono project for students. It's open to undergraduate and postgraduate students in our School of Law, so that's law and criminology students, and also to computer science students. And students have worked, we've had about 80 students over the last year working on a variety of projects, one with citizens advice, kind of testing different freely available chatbots to assess the accuracy and reliability of the legal advice they provide, one with a local law tech company who are trying out a case management system, one with a US law tech startup trialing their kind of customizable LLMs, one with LexisNexis developing resources on AI and legal education for them, and one working with Amazon Workspace, which we were lucky to get some funding towards some tokens to try and develop a kind of LLM chatbot style model that potentially our student legal advisors in our law clinic could use when they're looking at consumer law in particular. But as I mentioned before, one of the key drivers here has been to develop our students' digital literacies through these projects. And we've tried to do that in a few ways. And the first one is by making it interdisciplinary. We work with computer science. And it's been amazing for me because I have two amazing colleagues, Graham and James, that I work with. We found it quite hard. I think I wanted to work with computer science more than they wanted to work with me. So it's a bit of a work in progress, but I think that interdisciplinarity, as Andy and Lucia have demonstrated, is incredibly important, and it gives these hugely different perspectives and leads to this real richness in discussions. We ask all our students when they join our project to do a session on critical AI literacies. And this does talk about AI it covers things like hallucinations, but it talks about AI in a far broader way as well. So it does bring up those kind of societal consequences that I touched on earlier. So that gives them this sort of shared basis of understanding before they go and work on their individual projects. We also have a session on copyright law, which is, I'm going to be honest, it's perhaps not quite as interesting. But I think if you're working with data around AI, that it's really important for us as staff and students to understand the potential legal implications of what we're doing and what we're using. And we also signpost students to a lot of wider resources, because I find that sometimes students have been socialised into the idea we have to go to journal articles and that's the go-to source. But actually on this project and on our module, we really encourage engagement with blogs, with, YouTube, podcasts, all these different kind of mediums, always getting students to think critically about the content. But I think it's really important to give them that kind of breadth of exposure. One of the things we've been kind of experimenting this year is how much of it should be kind of instructor-led and how much of it should be about the students pursuing things independently. And don't think I have an answer about that. If we have it more instructor-led, we found it easier to scaffold these digital literacies over a specific period of time with careful planning. But equally, then I feel it gives students less opportunity to use those skills in practice and be, as Anne said, innovators. So I think it's a balance that's worth explicitly considering, and thinking about how we can sort of achieve all those objects together. One of the other things that we've worked hard to build in both the module and Sheffield Digital Justice is reflection, encouraging students to really reflect on their engagements with technology, with AI, and what that actually means for them, but more broadly for the legal profession, for society. The one thing I really want to build on and integrate more next year is digital well-being, because if you know me, you'll know this is what sort of well-being is my pet topic, but actually I think digital well-being is often somewhat overlooked. But if we're encouraging students to engage with technology, I think we have an ethical responsibility to give them advice and guidance on how to look after their digital well-being as well. I think, again, the two go hand in hand. So that's one of my focuses for next year.
Yeah, and I'm a massive supporter of that, because I think I don't know what this is trying to tell us about what happens next, but I think there's kind of like 3 ideas that I had in terms of, and I think I've run at least a couple of these past Emma. I'm not sure if I've run them all past them, but just thoughts on currently happening, because my brain tends to do this. One thing I was thinking about is the idea of hypernormalization. So this idea that none of us know what the fuck's going on, and we're looking for an answer on it, and the answer isn't coming from public spheres. It's coming from what's being fueled is the private sphere, the change from the public into the private, and how that leads us to disassociate, and that includes us and our students. And to name that and to explain that you've got that kind of chaotic feeling is a really useful step, I think. So I'd like to try and address some aspects of that. If we're recommending resources, you know, someone did earlier, like Adam Curtis, if you've come across any of his documentaries on this subject, he has a documentary called Hypernormalization, which I would recommend. He's also just brought out another one called Shifty, which is looking at neoliberalism within the UK, which is something I'm interested in. But that was one thing. Another thing was, obviously, as I say, collective sharing of failure, linking into what Emma said about well-being. And then the final thing was kind of like critical legal approaches. So the other resource I'd massively recommend is The New Age of Sexism, which is Laura Bates's book. I went to see her the other week, and she's kind of set that out as a series of case studies in terms of, from a feminist legal perspective, of the way in which AI perpetuates patriarchal norms, and the way in which it flattens some of this, and how we're going. Actually, the critical stuff that came out a bit in the module, which I'm really interested in, is how AI might, in a lot of perspectives, be taking us back before a lot of progress in some of these areas to a very flattened, problematic stage. And I'd like to be able to address some of that. The final thing I thought about just very quickly is, which I'm reading in a book at the moment, is how each one of our kind of news feeds or highlight reels are showing us an individualistic, personal version of success. And we're all getting different things, even though the perception might be we're all seeing the same content. And a lot of those highlight reels are perpetuating what we want to hear, because that's what they're feeding. And so that depends on what we're looking for and what we continue to look for. And the harm that creates is also one problem, but as well, it kind of denies this kind of collective sharing. So what I'd like to say to students is, if they're willing to share it, is, what are you seeing on your highlight reels? Can you share it? What have you seen in the last week on the various different social media news feeds, which are not news feeds anymore? They're very much not news feeds. They're not linear. They're not chronological. They're chaotic. So that was the final idea I had. I know that's a bit garbled, but I think it's really exciting. And again, I'm really excited to be working with Emma on this, because I think this module space allows the sharing of some of that, which takes time, which must involve less content just being driven at. But I hope we can achieve some of that, I guess.